Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Sarah Dupont. I'm the Aboriginal Engagement Librarian at the University of British Columbia Libraries. And I'd like to begin by acknowledging the territory of the Musqueam, the Tsleil-Waututh, and the Squamish Nations. In particular, the Musqueam, on whose traditional territory the University of British Columbia is occupied. We are on Musqueam territory, and we are blessed to be so geographically close to the knowledge that they continue to respectfully and provide trust in sharing that knowledge with us and the relationship that we continue to build together. It hasn't always been the relationship that it is today. It has changed over many years, and I have just started my journey on contributing to that relationship. But as we celebrated 100 years at the University of British Columbia, with the raising of the Musqueam House Post in the center of campus, there was an acknowledgement of that relationship, and I'm truly honored to have witnessed that. Okay. So that's just an image of, I think I need to find a better spot to stand. This is an image in front of the Huehua Library at UBC campus. And Huehua Library is part of the First Nations House of Learning. And you can see up at the top there, the round building, that's Huehua, and the First Nations House of Learning is right next to it. And so the art installation by Edgar Heap of Birds that you see in front of you, today your host is Musqueam. These are placed throughout campus, and British Columbia is written in the reverse. Just to finish telling you a little bit about who I am, I'm Métis from Prince George, so hi to anybody from Prince George or the Central Interior on the live cast. It's really nice to know that you might be there. I live in Vancouver now, but before I came to Vancouver, I went to library school at the University of Alberta, and I was employed directly out of school by the Edmonton Public Library. So I worked as a public librarian for about a year and a half as the Aboriginal Services Librarian, and I was responsible for a system-wide approach to programming, collections, and staff awareness training through Edmonton Public Libraries. And I just wanted to really recognize the work that Edmonton is doing. There was a question earlier about boards and having a seat at the table, and when I worked there, I felt truly blessed to have the guidance of an Aboriginal Advisory Committee. And there was an elder, a Métis elder there, Giselle Wood, and she really helped to guide me, because it is difficult when you're the only person in a library system and there is a huge burden placed upon you, and you're asked frequently to provide the Indigenous perspective on a particular issue, and humbly we don't speak for all Indigenous people, and so the burden of providing the guidance to help answer that question can be challenging at times. So I was really grateful, and I often considered myself an employee of that advisory committee at times, and you may have heard the phrase walking in two worlds. It was definitely that case when I was working. I felt like I was working for two different bosses who had an ultimately similar goal, and it was a really great opportunity to do that. But they've changed, and they actually have one of the former advisory committee members now sitting on the board, the library board. And so that's truly courageous, and I want to recognize them for their work. I'm also the convener of the First Nations Interest Group, and I have been since 2012, but I'd also like to acknowledge Nancy Hannum and Jean Joseph, and Linda, and Kim, and Beth, and all of the people who came before me for doing over 25 years now of amazing work in this province to address the issues of providing services to remote and rural communities, particularly library services on reserves. So Huehua Library, as you can see in the photo, is architecturally really cool. It is an interior Salish pit house, and we provide services that help address and contribute to the mandate of the First Nations House of Learning to address this Aboriginal strategic plan. But important to note is that this library came about because of a community-driven initiative. The money for the First Nations House of Learning and the library was fundraised for by the community. And the collections that initially were there were donated from a lot of community members. So now, as a part of the UBC Library, we provide a welcoming space for Aboriginal students, a strong research collection, and our research interests have a lot to do with an initiative in Indigenous Knowledge Organization. I also work at the Irving K. Barber Learning Center, which has a province-wide community engagement mandate to support lifelong learning in remote and rural communities. Something that's happening right now that I think is relevant to our conversation today is a conference that, if you're on Twitter, check out the hashtag since 2016. This is the Canadian Indigenous National, oh dear, what's the acronym? It's a lot of people talking about what truth and reconciliation means, and I just want to acknowledge Kim Lawson, Anne Carr-Wiggin, and Deborah Lee, who are librarians presenting at this conference and talking about the work that libraries can be doing. I pulled a couple of tweets that Chris Shepard was quoted of saying, "Hard work and heart work in research and reconciliation. And nurture relationships first, and the research questions will come from the community." So, speaking a little bit about what the University of British Columbia is doing to respond to the truth and reconciliation calls to action, it's kind of difficult because I want to share a lot with you about what we're doing, but to do so in 10 minutes in a really humble way, but in a way that inspires different academic institutions to be part of this journey with us. It's challenging, so forgive me as I stumble through a way to do that in a good way. I'm really happy to announce that the Center for Indian Residential School History and Dialogue just passed Board 3 approval at UBC. So it is a project that we can talk about that is going to be happening, and I'm really proud to say that. A lot of work went into the proposal for that center, and in order to illustrate what this center is to be as it develops, I just want to read a paragraph that's from that proposal, because a lot of good minds, Link Kessler in particular, the senior advisor to the President on Aboriginal Affairs, put to that. So in this proposal, it reads, while deliberately seeking to erase Aboriginal culture and assimilate Aboriginal students, segregating and punishing them, the schools created a legacy that has left many in Aboriginal communities ambivalent about all formal education and what it might mean for them. Canadian public education, by leaving a vast silence on the actual history of the schools and on Canadian Aboriginal relations more generally, has created a condition of national amnesia from which we are all struggling to recover. For survivors and their families, Aboriginal community elders and members coming to visit the centre, and for our partners in the Indian Residential School Survivors Society and other organizations who are collaborating in its design, the center's location in the heart of the university will present a different answer and point to a different future. This center is important in its location and in its function. It's going to be situated between the two largest libraries at UBC. Here we have the Kerner Library and the Irving K. Barber Learning Center, and the Indian Residential School History and Dialogue Center will be where that red box is. The library actually contributed space. It gave the first floor gallery, which will now become the first floor of this residential school history and dialogue center. Oops. So what is this space going to do, and what's going to happen in there? It's going to provide access to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission records held in Winnipeg, as it will be affiliated with the National Research Centre at the University of Manitoba. It's going to hold other records as well for former students, their families and communities, and information based in records for students and the public. It will also serve as a place for community members and scholars to gather for conversations on the cultural memory, the use of history, and collaborative work towards the sustainability of Indigenous communities and more effective communications among different groups. So we've been thinking about this arrival of this center for quite a few years now, and how did we start to prepare campus for this dialogue? It started by stopping. UBC actually suspended classes so that students could partake in the West Coast National event held over several days at the PNE grounds in Vancouver in 2014. It's very rare for classes to be suspended, and this was the first time that classes had been suspended since the Second World War.